There's a moment when everything changes, when the comfortable lies that have sustained an institution for centuries suddenly collide with scientific truth. That moment arrived like a thunderbolt on an ordinary day. A genetic report, 4 pages, sealed in envelopes that were never meant to be opened. And yet they were, because someone, somewhere, decided that the truth mattered more than tradition. Subscribe right now, because what you're about to hear will fundamentally challenge everything you thought you understood about the British monarchy and how power actually works. The foundation of any monarchy rests on a single concept: bloodline, not capability, not character, not even wisdom or strength, just blood, pure blood, documented blood. Blood that can be traced backward through centuries of meticulous record-keeping, through wars and betrayals and marriages arranged for political advantage. The entire system, the entire institution, the entire justification for why one family should rule over millions of people is built on this singular concept. The blood is sacred. The blood is untouchable. The blood is what makes them different, what makes them deserving, what makes them royal. But what happens when that blood is questioned? What happens when science provides evidence that the bloodline isn't what everyone has been told it is? That's the question that began to haunt the monarchy when certain individuals inside the palace walls decided they needed to know the truth, not for curiosity, not for peace of mind, but because they sensed something was wrong. They sensed that something about the official narrative didn't align with reality, and they decided to verify their suspicions. The decision to conduct a genetic test was made in absolute secrecy. This wasn't something that could be announced or acknowledged or explained to anyone outside a very small circle of trusted individuals. Because if word got out that there was doubt about the legitimacy of someone's bloodline, if there was even a whisper that genetic testing was being conducted, it could trigger a constitutional crisis. So the order was given quietly. Through channels that could never be traced, the test would be conducted, the results would be secured, and only those with the highest clearance would know what those results revealed. A biological sample was collected under the guise of routine medical procedures, the kind of thing that happens constantly in medical facilities around the world. Nobody suspected anything unusual. Nobody questioned the legitimacy of what was happening. The sample was transported in temperature-controlled conditions to a facility in a neutral country where discretion was absolute, where people had been trained to handle sensitive material without asking questions or forming opinions about what they were processing. The genetic testing itself was conducted with scientific precision, the kind of precision that leaves no room for error or ambiguity. The sample was analyzed, the results were verified, they were checked again, and then checked a third time to eliminate any possibility that something had gone wrong during the testing process. When all the testing was complete, when every possible source of error had been eliminated, the results were presented in clinical language. Language designed to be objective and emotionless. Language that nonetheless contained information so devastating that it could reshape the entire future of the monarchy. What the testing revealed was a divergence, a genetic profile that didn't perfectly align with what had been expected. The markers that should have been present, the markers that had been documented in the family for generations, showed variations that suggested a lineage that wasn't entirely consistent with the official historical record. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't scandalous in the way that explosive revelations are scandalous. It was simply inconsistent, which in the context of an institution built entirely on the concept of genetic purity was the most damning thing possible. The reaction inside the palace was instantaneous and severe. Doors were locked. Conversations ceased the moment an unauthorized person entered a room. The genetic report was handled as though it was contaminated with a dangerous pathogen. It was secured in a vault. Access was restricted to only the most senior individuals, and immediately a decision was made. This information could never become public. This information could never be allowed to circulate. This information had to be contained, controlled, and if necessary, destroyed. Files began disappearing. Documents that might have provided supporting evidence were moved to secure locations or eliminated entirely. Officials swore oaths of secrecy that were binding not just by law, but by fear of what exposure could mean for their careers, their reputations, and potentially their safety. The palace entered a state of controlled panic. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Ceremonies continued. Official duties were performed. The public saw no indication that anything was wrong. But beneath the surface, the institution was grappling with a crisis of legitimacy that threatened to unravel everything. Because if the woman who shared the throne, the woman who was supposed to embody the purity of the royal bloodline, was not actually connected to that bloodline in the way that had been officially claimed, then what did that mean for the monarchy itself? What did it mean for the concept of hereditary rule? What did it mean for the justification that had been given to billions of people as to why this particular family deserved to hold power? The woman at the center of the scandal was a figure who had long been controversial. She had come from outside the traditional aristocratic circles. She had been married before. She had a history that was complex and sometimes questioned. But she had also been elevated to the highest position by the king himself, who had fought against significant opposition to secure her place at his side. He had essentially made a bet that his judgment was sound, that her character and her dedication were more important than the whispers about her background, that love and commitment could overcome centuries of protocol and tradition. Now that bet was being called, and the results were suggesting that the whispers had been right all along, not necessarily about her character or her intentions, but about something far more fundamental, about her connection to the lineage that was supposed to define her position, about whether she had ever had the legitimate right to occupy the role she currently held. For years, she had faced criticism and suspicion. Courtiers who had worked in the palace for decades remembered old conversations about her family, conversations that had been dismissed as gossip, but which had left a lingering sense of unease. Questions had been asked about her origins, questions that had never been fully answered. Explanations had been offered, but they had never quite satisfied everyone. There had always been a sense that something didn't add up, that something about her narrative didn't quite align with documented fact. But without concrete evidence, it was impossible to do anything about those suspicions. Tradition and protocol required that once someone had been elevated to a certain position, that position couldn't simply be taken away based on gossip or hearsay. You needed proof, you needed documentation, you needed something that couldn't be denied or explained away or dismissed as jealousy or malice. Now they had that proof. Now they had genetic evidence that could not be disputed or reinterpreted. And the question facing the senior members of the royal family was simple but devastating. What were they going to do with this information? How were they going to handle it? Could they continue to pretend they didn't know what they now knew? Could they allow the deception to continue indefinitely? Or did they have an obligation to act on what the science had revealed? Different members of the family began to position themselves according to their own understanding of what needed to happen. Some wanted to continue the cover-up. They believed that exposing the truth would be more damaging to the institution than maintaining the lie. They argued that the monarchy's survival depended on nobody ever learning what the genetic testing had revealed. They suggested that the report should be destroyed and everyone involved should maintain absolute silence about what they had discovered. Others believed that the truth, once discovered, had a way of emerging eventually. That attempting to suppress it indefinitely was foolish and dangerous. They argued that it would be better to address the situation proactively rather than waiting for the information to leak and having to respond in a state of crisis. They suggested that transparency, while painful in the short term, would ultimately be better for the institution's long-term credibility. The king himself was caught in the middle of this internal conflict. He had made his choice decades ago when he decided to elevate this woman to the throne. He had fought for her. He had defended her against all criticism. He had essentially staked his reputation and his legacy on the belief that his judgment was correct. Now he was being presented with evidence that contradicted the basic premise of that choice, and he was being forced to confront the possibility that he had been wrong, that he had been deceived, that the woman he had fought for was not what she had claimed to be. The conflict within the family deepened. The heir, the one who would eventually assume leadership of the institution, began to voice concerns about the situation. He suggested that the monarchy's long-term survival depended on addressing the issue honestly. He was joined by other senior members of the family who believed that continuing to hide the truth was untenable. But the king resisted. He defended the woman. He questioned the legitimacy of the genetic testing. He suggested that there had been error or sabotage. He clung to his belief that his choice had been correct and that everyone else was wrong. The internal conflict became more bitter. The divisions within the family became more pronounced. What had once been a united front began to fracture along ideological lines. Meanwhile, the woman at the center of the scandal began to sense that something was wrong. She noticed the careful distances being maintained. She sensed the shift in tone during conversations. She observed the meaningful glances exchanged between family members. She began to understand that her position was under threat in ways that she couldn't quite articulate but could definitely feel. She responded the way she had learned to respond to threats over her lifetime. She consolidated her allies. She worked to silence anyone who might be spreading doubts about her legitimacy. She attempted to control the narrative before it could control her, but she was fighting against something far more powerful than gossip or political maneuvering. She was fighting against documented scientific fact, and no amount of institutional power could make that fact disappear once it had been revealed. The tension inside the palace grew almost unbearable. Staff members sensed the conflict even if they didn't understand its source. Conversations that should have been routine became strained and artificial. The ceremonial functions of the monarchy continued, but they felt hollow. The institution was going through the motions of normalcy while internally grappling with an existential crisis, and then, inevitably, the pressure became too great. Someone, at some point, decided that the truth was more important than loyalty. Someone made a copy of the genetic report. Someone preserved the evidence that the palace was desperately trying to contain. Someone decided that the public deserved to know what had been hidden from them. The leak happened without warning. One moment the secret was contained within palace walls. The next moment it was everywhere. A journalist received an encrypted message, an attachment, the complete genetic report, unredacted, with all the official seals and signatures that proved its authenticity. Within hours, the story had exploded across every major news outlet in the world. The headline was impossible to ignore. DNA test reveals genetic inconsistencies in royal bloodline claims. By afternoon, it was the only story anyone was discussing. By evening, it had become a global phenomenon. The palace's immediate response was denial mixed with institutional panic. Spokespersons issued statements suggesting the report was fraudulent. They claimed the testing had never been authorized. They threatened legal action against any media outlet publishing the document. They attempted to discredit the journalist who had released the information. But none of it mattered, because the evidence existed. It had been verified by independent experts, and no amount of denial could make it disappear. The woman wearing the crown watched as her world disintegrated in real time. She saw former allies suddenly claiming they had always had reservations about her legitimacy. She witnessed people she had known for years positioning themselves as opponents rather than supporters. She experienced the full force of institutional abandonment as those around her began protecting their own interests by distancing themselves from her. The speed of the transformation was shocking. One day she was queen, the next day she was a symbol of deception. The public reaction was overwhelming. Protests erupted outside the palace. Citizens who had accepted her presence now felt betrayed. They felt manipulated. They felt that they had been lied to by an institution that had asked them to place faith in its legitimacy. The genetic irregularities, once contained within palace walls, were now being discussed in homes and workplaces across the nation. People debated what it meant. People questioned what else might be hidden. People began to lose faith in an institution that had asked for their absolute trust while maintaining absolute secrecy. The king was devastated. He had made his choice based on love and a belief in his own judgment. Now that judgment was being publicly questioned. Now the woman he had fought for was being publicly condemned. Now he was being forced to confront the possibility that he had been catastrophically wrong. The weight of that realization seemed to physically crush him. He aged visibly. He withdrew from public appearances. He became a hollow figure going through the motions of kingship while emotionally destroyed by the unfolding crisis. The heir, the future of the monarchy, moved with calculated precision. He understood that the institution's survival depended on swift and decisive action. He began positioning himself as the voice of institutional reform. He suggested that the monarchy could only survive by acknowledging the truth and taking responsibility for it. He positioned himself in opposition to those who wanted to continue the cover-up. He essentially began preparing to assume leadership of an institution in crisis. The internal conflict intensified. The king wanted to preserve the woman and the deception. The heir wanted to expose the truth and move forward. Their conversations became heated. Their positions became irreconcilable. What had been a family was beginning to feel like opposing armies preparing for battle. The divisions were not just ideological, they were emotional, they were personal. They threatened to tear the entire institution apart from the inside. Senior members of the family began to choose sides. Some supported the king's attempt to preserve the status quo. Others supported the heir's push for institutional transformation. The palace, which had always presented a united front to the world, was now revealed to be deeply fractured. The cracks that had been carefully hidden were now visible to everyone. The woman attempted to fight for her position. She released statements defending her legitimacy. She suggested the genetic testing was flawed. She claimed she was the victim of a political conspiracy. She argued that her worth should be measured not by her bloodline, but by her years of service and dedication. But her defense sounded hollow. It sounded desperate. It sounded like the words of someone who knew their position was untenable, but was refusing to accept it. More documents began to emerge. Emails discussing the genetic testing, memos about damage control strategy, records showing that senior members of the family had known about the irregularities for years. With each new document, the situation grew worse. With each new revelation, the deception became more undeniable. The palace's attempt to contain the scandal only seemed to generate more questions and more demands for answers. Parliament became involved. MPs demanded transparency. Constitutional committees were convened. Serious discussions began about whether the monarchy could survive in its current form if its fundamental claim to legitimacy was based on deception. Legal scholars debated what mechanisms existed for removing someone from power if their legitimacy had been disproven. The machinery of government began to turn toward the monarchy as if preparing to hold it accountable. International observers watched with a mixture of fascination and concern. This was not just a British problem. This had implications for every monarchy in the world. If genetic science could undermine claims of legitimacy, what did that mean for hereditary rule itself? What did it mean for the concept of divine right or historical destiny? The woman's position became increasingly untenable. She was isolated. Her supporters had abandoned her. The public was demanding her removal. Even family members who had initially supported her were beginning to suggest that she should step back from official duties. The pressure was coming from all directions, and there was nowhere left to hide. Behind closed doors, difficult conversations were taking place. The king was being confronted with reality. He was being told in no uncertain terms that the woman he had fought for would have to step down, not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. The institution would not survive if she remained in power. The public would not accept it. Parliament would not accept it. Even members of the family would not accept it. The king resisted at first. He begged for alternatives. He suggested compromises. He argued that she could reduce her public role while maintaining her title. He grasped for any solution that would allow him to preserve some version of his original choice. But there were no alternatives. The evidence was irrefutable. The public was demanding change. The institution was on the verge of collapse. The woman, sensing that she was about to lose everything, made one final attempt to preserve her position. She threatened to go public with information about the king, information about decisions that had been made, information that could damage the entire family if it became known. It was an act of institutional blackmail, a desperate attempt to force everyone to maintain the deception in exchange for her silence. But the threat backfired. Instead of forcing the family to preserve the secret, it accelerated her downfall. Because now she was not just illegitimate, she was also threatening the institution's survival. She had become a liability that needed to be removed regardless of the personal cost. The decision was made. She would step down, not voluntarily, but with the appearance of voluntariness. A statement would be released about health concerns. Official duties would be suspended. She would fade from public view. She would become invisible. She would effectively cease to exist in the consciousness of the monarchy. It was presented to her as a choice, though everyone understood it was not a choice. Accept the arrangement or face public exposure of the threats she had made. Accept the arrangement or watch the institution attempt to remove her by force. She negotiated the terms as best she could. She ensured she would remain married to the king. She ensured she would retain some form of title. She ensured that her removal would not be presented as a forced exile, but as a voluntary step back from official duties. And then, with a grace that surprised everyone, she accepted her fate. She released a statement about needing to focus on her health. She announced that she would be stepping back from official royal duties. She suggested this was her own decision made in consultation with her family. Within days, her photographs had been removed from official displays. Her name began to disappear from historical records. She became a ghost in the institution she had fought so hard to be part of. The public's reaction was complex. There was relief that the crisis was being addressed. There was satisfaction that she was being removed. But there was also a lingering sense that something fundamental had been broken, that the institution had been exposed as built on deception, that the trust that had been placed in it had been violated. The wound would heal, but the scar would never completely disappear. The king was left alone with his grief. He had lost the woman he loved, not to death, but to institutional necessity. He had been forced to choose between his heart and his duty, and duty had won. But the victory felt like defeat. The silence that followed was deafening. The woman who had been removed continued to live in the palace, invisible to the world. She existed in private spaces, fed, cared for, but erased, a living ghost in gilded halls. It was a kind of death without the mercy of actual death. The heir assumed his position as the voice of institutional reform. He began speaking about transparency, about the need for modernization, about moving beyond the deceptions of the past. He positioned himself as the future, as the solution to the crisis his father's generation had created. The king aged rapidly. The weight of his choice seemed to physically crush him. He had fought for love and lost. He had sacrificed the institution for a woman and been forced to sacrifice the woman for the institution. The grief consumed him in his final years. Parliament convened special sessions. Constitutional scholars debated the monarchy's future. Some called for reform, others for abolition. The institution that had seemed permanent was suddenly questioned in fundamental ways. The public over time moved past the scandal. Other crises emerged. Other controversies occupied their attention. The revelation became history. But the wound remained. The scar never fully disappeared. Years later, when the heir eventually became king, the monarchy had transformed, not dramatically, but fundamentally. Transparency became official policy. Genetic records became subject to independent verification. The institution that had been built on secrets began, tentatively, to embrace truth. The woman died quietly in the palace, still invisible, still erased. Her death merited barely a mention in the media, a brief obituary, then silence. She became a footnote in history, a cautionary tale about the price of deception. The monarchy survived, but it was changed, humbled, no longer claiming absolute moral authority, just claiming carefully to be honest about what it was, and for an institution built on centuries of myth and mystique, that honesty felt like a revolutionary transformation. The bloodline had been compromised, the deception had been exposed, the institution had been forced to evolve, and in that evolution lay the seeds of something that, while less glorious than what had come before, might actually be worth preserving. The crown endured, changed, wounded, but endured nonetheless.